Daniel Parolek is a urban designer. He's an architect, author, and founding principal of Opticos Designs. Join me in giving him a round of applause.
Thank you, Randy, and thanks everybody. What a great event, right? Congratulations to Groundworks for putting on this great event, and thank you for hosting me here today. So, Bruce and Ellie, what great speakers to follow up with. And I think as I've been thinking about this and listening to the questions and to the conversation to date, a couple of things came to mind. And the first one is we have found in our clients and communities that we work with that personalizing the discussion about the need for housing choices and personalizing the discussion about missing middle housing is really, really important. And just to give you an example, I grew up in a small Midwestern town, very similar to a lot of the small towns here in your region. And my great-grandmother lived in a duplex a block and a half from Main Street in a unit that was probably no bigger than 650 square feet. But for her, it was a perfect size, it was a perfect location, and almost everything she needed was within walking distance or maybe a short driving distance. So really personalizing these discussions, because I think every single person in the room here today probably either has a story about when at some point in their life when they've lived in a missing middle housing type, or their kids are living in one, or their best friend, or their aunt and uncle. And so I just think that's really important. And I also wanted to tie back to what Randy said at the very beginning of this conversation and event today, which is really important, is just like housing as just a very basic need, right? That's really, really important that we don't get caught up in, wow, that's too dense. Oh, we don't want multifamily in our neighborhood. Oh, it's gonna cause too much traffic. Oh, like all of these topics that we get caught up in and we forget about what this is really about is providing housing choices that many households need, right? As your region, the prices have gone up so much that there's, right, a large percentage of your households that can't afford single-family detached houses, and that's a majority of what you've been producing, and anywhere into the near past. And then secondarily, it's about providing choice, because the National Association of Realtors does an annual survey, a preference survey. And starting in the 2000s, the desire for walkability started really growing in these results. And they had a hard time kind of asking the right questions of what the right trade-offs would be. But last year, I think for the first time, this survey results showed that majority of households surveyed would prefer to live in a walkable neighborhood in a non-single family housing choice. And they'd live in a smaller home, they would have okay with a smaller yard if their neighborhood had that walkability. And so this just reinforces the points that Ellie was making and Bruce was making about this importance of making sure we're delivering those choices. Just tying this back a little bit to the other presentations. So Bruce said something super interesting that I'd never heard before. He said, the zoning fix is a precondition, period. The zoning has to change or we will not deliver the housing we need. I'd never heard that before, but it's such an eloquent, he just was like, move on. Like the zoning has to change, like no questions asked. I think, and he showed, right, examples of states passing legislation to remove single-family zoning, cities like Minneapolis removing single-family zoning, but the sad reality is there's still 90% of places, including your region here, where these choices are just outright illegal in the majority of the geographic area of your cities. And so, and then Ellie's great point, which I'll tie into a couple of case studies, is right. I mean, lots of really great points, but just the unsustainable nature of the current growth patterns in your region. And it's unsustainable in a lot of ways. It's unsustainable fiscally, it's unsustainable socially, and it's unsustainable environmentally. And impact of quality of life that is part of your secret sauce. So, and then there was the 20 years of talk comment from somebody in the audience. And the reason that zoning hasn't changed more broadly is that it's a tough conversation, right? It's not an easy thing politically to do. And unfortunately, that's why states are now, well, I don't know, you can see there's pluses and minuses, right? States are having to step up to sort of trump the local jurisdictions, but it's a tough conversation, right? And I think part of this is how we frame, really, really important. I feel that why the missing middle housing concept has caught on so broadly is because it's given regions, communities, the terminology and the proper way to frame a discussion about housing, needed housing, without getting into the terminology and just really bad framing that we've typically done. And one point I like to make is we need to step away from metrics in this housing conversation. And what I mean by that, and I know the screen is really tiny for those of you who are in the back, but right, this is a great 2-story courtyard apartment building that me and a group of people discovered on a missing middle walking tour. And everybody loved this housing type, right? It's not offensive. It's about the scale of a house. It was on a block that had single family homes. And then I usually we do a documentation exercise. I was like, somebody go calculate the lot size. Somebody go count the mailboxes for the number of units. And we came back and we ran the math. And can anybody guess what the density, I don't like this word, what was the density of this building type? Planners in the room in particular. How many planners do we have in the room? Or developers? Can somebody just, and if you were at the ULI event, you can't say because I use the same slide. So can anybody just shout it out? Shout it out. 80. Nope. 12? Nope. I guess I should do prices right, higher, lower. Anybody else? 46, 70. Okay, nobody was even close. This is 120 dwelling units per acre. And as Ellie was saying, most of your comprehensive plans cap out at probably 20, and it's considered high density. And so we have this entire planning and zoning system that high density equals big, high density equals bad, and high density equals I don't want it in my neighborhood, right? And so this is where we say, don't use the D word, because the majority of your community members, or almost anybody in this room, when you say density, you think bad things. So just stop using that word. And sometimes, like in our office, we have a little quarter jar. Anytime you say density, like you have to put a quarter in it, like the cuss jar. We need to change the way we communicate about this. And so, and even like multifamily, like that term is a term that is way past its effective use. So like, who wants multifamily in their neighborhood? Like, it just sounds kind of scary, doesn't it? Like something you wouldn't really want. And so the second thing, right, it's making simple solutions legal. Like our planning and zoning system doesn't even know how to categorize the most simple of the missing middle housing types, like this cottage court. Like, is that multifamily? Is it single family attached? What does that really mean? And why is it necessary to classify it? Let's just say we want to allow cottages and cottage courts and then back into the right way to deliver those. And so, this really, we're having to think big about these really small scale housing solutions that we call missing middle housing that we feel are really important. And I do want to say they're usually just one tool in a region's or a city's housing toolbox. It's not a one size fits all or the only solution that cities needs, but it is an important one. And so I promise not to do a 101, But for those of you who are new to this topic, I have 3 or 4 slides here to just ground us, because a lot of times missing middle housing conversation jumps immediately to middle income. And we say, let's pull that conversation back and talk about the form and scale and range of housing types that is most important. And you can see there's single family detached, there's bigger apartment or condo buildings on the far right, and it's all of these typologies, a duplex, a fourplex, a mansion apartment, townhouses, that we call the missing middle, that we've built very, very little of, that exist in every pre-1940s neighborhood they were built before we made them illegal. And so that's really important. And so this idea of house scale buildings is really, really important. So if you're going to take one thing away from this, is that missing middle housing are house scale buildings with multiple units. Because there's also this notion that when you add more units, it means the building's going to get bigger. But the reality is you can have a house scale building and it might have 3, 4, or 5 units in it, and they might just be a little bit smaller, or it's just designed really well to make it look that way. And just as an example, right, you could drive by this building, you could walk by it, ride your bike by it, and not realize that there's actually 3 units in that building, right? It's a triplex. But it looks and feels and behaves much like a single-family home, which is really, really important to this, because they did historically sit on a same street face as single-family homes, and they behaved with one another. And right, this great Our Housing Future report very clearly identified in your 4 biggest jurisdictions here. It's hard to see, but the light blue where the arrows are pointing are 2 to 9 units. Right, that's the missing middle existing, and there's actually a higher percentage than in a lot of markets, but it's never more than like 20 to 25% of any one of these cities has these range of missing middle types. So I guess we can consider them missing still. And so how does missing middle fit into the affordable housing conversation? Is that on one end of the affordable housing barbell, you have the need for subsidized housing, right? There's going to be a need to lower the lowest income households, of whether somebody to come in and subsidize the delivery of those units. On the other end of that is just increasing supply, right? I think it was Duke that said we have extreme shortage of supply because you haven't been delivering enough housing in this region, and that's pretty common all across the country. And the missing middle just fits right in the middle of that, where we call attainable by design. Just with more compact design, smaller lots, maybe slightly smaller units, you can actually get to that affordability just simply through good design if it is allowed in your zoning. Now, we've thoughtfully and extensively documented a full range of these types. That's available in the book that Groundwork has so graciously purchased a bunch of copies of to give away. So feel free to come grab it. And it's also, if you go to missingmiddlehousing.com, all this information is available for this full range of types and the characteristics for each of those types, like this cottage court here. And so the focus of my presentation today is talking about sort of getting beyond just the concept of missing middle, which has been around for over 10 years now, and talking about solutions in both the public sector, what are cities doing, what are regional planning agencies doing, what are states doing, and as well as private sectors, what are developers delivering when those barriers are actually removed for the delivery of missing middle. And so I'm going to cover both of those examples. And starting with the public sector. So we do a pretty broad range of projects, scaled from like an individual neighborhood up to a region. But there's a set of shared tools and techniques that I just wanted to give a really brief overview before I dive into some of the case studies. We created this Venn diagram called the missing middle sweet spot, which we feel is really, really important because we see cities attempting to do the right thing but missing the mark on the delivery of missing middle. So at the top of this, you have feasibility. And what this means as we're writing a zoning code or doing missing middle policy and zoning changes, we're working with an economist or a local developer to do a pro forma analysis of whether or not these projects, as are envisioned, would make sense, would produce a profit, and would encourage a developer to come in to deliver these privately. So we're testing that to make sure that the project would be feasible to a developer. And in the green is attainability, because this is hard for people to get their head around, but you can actually allow more than one unit on a lot, and what gets delivered is not attainable. And let me just give you an example. I recently, in a city we were working in, they allowed 4 units on a lot. Somebody bought a cottage, tore it down, and they built 4 what we call tall, skinny houses, like with a little bit of space in between, on that lot. And each one of those 4 houses sold for 125% of what the original developer purchased that original house for. So each one of those new houses, because they're new, got a premium, and actually there was 0 attainability delivered, which means that that city needs to allow more units on that lot to actually deliver attainability. And then third is livability, because right, you don't want to just build more housing for housing's sake. You want it to be livable, and so you need to be thoughtful. That's more subjective than the other two, but it is important to keep in mind. And then not stopping at good policy. For those of planners or maybe even developers in the audience, how many times have you opened up a policy document and it was the most wonderful, flowery policy text about walkability and mixed-use communities and all these great things, but when the rubber hits the road, there's like 100 barriers to get that thing that the policy recommends. And so this example was from the city of Memphis, Tennessee, where we worked with them on a citywide comprehensive plan, but that had a really strong missing middle policy as part of it, but they didn't stop there. We currently did 7 area plans in areas identified in the comprehensive plan that sort of got more specific about what changes would need to be made to enable missing middle housing more broadly in Memphis. And they're about to embark on their zoning code update. Visualizing the potential outcomes. This is super, super important. Now, we as architects, we can look at a site and we can, in our head, we can understand like what that would look like. So, right, this could be anywhere. This could be along one of your corridors here in the region, a underutilized grayfield site. We start talking about, well, it could become a missing middle neighborhood, but the reality is you really need to show the community members, the decision makers, what that is going to look and feel like to build the support for those efforts. And I think this is a really, really important part of our work, and I think it's really, really important part of every missing middle effort, regardless of the scale. All of our efforts end with zoning changes. We don't stop short of changing the zoning because we understand that that's one of the biggest barriers. Do you realize that zoning was first implemented the same decade that this camera was built? Right? Zoning is now 100 years old, so we're working with a 100-year-old operating system to try to deliver 21st century living. So you can understand why that might be a problem. And so what you really need, right, is this. So it's not a simple fix, and I think that's one of the really big parts is that conventional zoning has never effectively delivered housing choice, ever. All of the good examples were built prior to zoning being put in place. So that's why it's so hard. That's one of the reasons it's so hard. And then just making a point of, you can be really, really direct about in your zoning districts. So instead of saying, we're going to allow 22 units per acre, or the lot coverage is going to be 20%, maybe 25, or the FAR, floor area ratio maximum is going to be 0.5. Like, you try to do the math of those things, like they stop making sense really quickly, is you can just say, this is a zoning district called neighborhood small footprint. You can call it whatever you want, missing middle, housing choice, and you can just say directly what housing types you want in that particular area where that zoning district is mapped. So it's pretty direct. And we don't do that in all of our codes. Sometimes we go in and do some really targeted fixes, but there is a way. And I want to say that 20 plus years ago, Mary Madden, my colleague, and a group of us founded the Form-Based Code Institute. And the real idea behind that was to push for zoning reform. And it's only now, 20 years later and 17 years after my form-based code book, that it's kind of happening at this baby pace. and it needs to happen much more quickly. So solutions at the public sector. We realize that what most cities need and how we can maximize our thought leadership is doing something quick and direct for a city. After getting caught up in like 4 and 5, 6 year battles with the citywide zoning code, we said, you know what? Let's create a new tool. And so we created what we call the missing middle scan and a missing middle deep dive. And what we call this the diagnosis before the surgery. This is like, often we'll do this prior to a city doing a comprehensive plan, or we'll do it prior to a city doing a comprehensive zoning ordinance update. And it gives them the specific direction and guidance they need to enable missing middle housing. And we have done it in parallel as well. So the first thing that it does is it frames the local conversation effectively and visually. And you'll see just based on my presentation, we're very visual in our communication. The second thing it does is it prioritizes geographically where the missing middle should be applied, right? And what was really cool, and we did this in Greenville, South Carolina, and they took this missing middle priority area map and they adopted it in their comprehensive plan on the same spread as the future land use strategy. So the missing middle housing priority map became a policy in the comprehensive plan, and specifically where geographically they should allow that. So that's a really cool application. Thirdly, it identifies specific barriers, and I think these have come up a number of times today, but this is a very thorough assessment, right? A lot of zoning code analysis sort of stops at a really high level. Parking requirements are too high. Your lot sizes are too big. Like, we could make a list of 10 of them that every zoning code here locally has, but we really dig down deep into the details of within each of the zoning districts, what changes are going to be required to deliver missing middle housing types. And we also systematically go through policy in the comprehensive plans and area plans and identify the barriers. You can see the red dots are barriers and the green dots are where the policy is okay. And then there's the graphic testing of the zoning code. And what we do is, right, we take the 3 or 4 zoning districts and we basically, this is what the existing zoning hypothetically allows. There's usually a scenario where what does it actually allow or encourage or incentivize? And then there's what's the missing middle ideal that you really want your zoning to allow, and then you reverse engineer your zoning district to get to that ideal by making some targeted changes. So the second solution I wanted to talk a little bit about is a citywide missing middle plan that we're just about to complete for the city of Sacramento, California. It's one of our biggest applications to date. And there's a few things that I really like about this. Is kind of taking that idea of the scan and kind of taking it to the next level. And one of my favorite parts of this, and what I think every one of these efforts should include, is there's a displacement risk analysis. Because we all know that if you go in and change your zoning, right, there's certain neighborhoods that are going to be impacted more than others. And so we want to be thoughtful about, in Sacramento's case, it just happened to be like there's neighborhoods with the black and brown households that were more likely to be displaced if they just wholesale kind of turn the knobs on their zoning. And so the city wanted to be really thoughtful about, let's mitigate those impacts and think about other things we can do to reduce that risk of displacement for those important community members. Back to the pro forma analysis or the feasibility analysis, which was really cool about this is we actually ran pro forma analysis for 4 or 5 building types in each neighborhood in a for rent scenario and a for sale scenario. And then we scored them to understand which were the most likely to happen or if we need to make certain adjustments, and identified the best performing types in each of those scenarios. And so that's pretty comprehensive, but it was really informative. We weren't just picking numbers off the shelf. We were actually really testing and vetting those numbers. The idea in Sacramento was it wasn't a one-size-fits-all strategy for all the different reasons I might have mentioned in other analysis of there were going to be 3 different tiers of like a high, medium, and low missing middle application. And so the zoning and the allowed types for each of those different areas would be different. So once just a really thoughtful, nuanced approach. And once again, like it was important to just visualize, well, what does a fourplex with an ADU in the back look like on a existing corner lot? And so we illustrated that, and we use these illustrations to build support and to help make some changes to the draft zoning standards that we put in place. Another really, really neat tool that we used in Sacramento is what's called a sliding scale FAR. And this has been proven to be successful in Portland, Oregon for their R1 housing strategy. It's one of the case studies in my book. But what this does is the allowed FAR increases as you add more units. You have to be really thoughtful about this so it doesn't deliver out-of-scale buildings, but we were able to demonstrate that the fourplex not only delivered the best return for the developer, so it's the most likely choice, it also delivered the highest level of attainability through this system. So it's a pretty nuanced way to be thinking about this. In Louisville, Kentucky, we're taking a similar methodology, but we're digitizing it. We're using ArcGIS to create what's called a story map, housing priority story map. And I think this is really, instead of having a printed document that will often sit on a shelf, this gets embedded directly into the GIS data, and it becomes something that anybody can access if they have access to a computer. And so I think this is the next generation. And this is citywide, and we're super, super excited about this. So just keep an eye out on this. I think this will be really exciting as a final product. And this, once again, we don't stop at that big citywide policy. We actually dive down into each of those case study neighborhoods and demonstrate like what it would look and feel like from a very basic design standpoint on the most common lot sizes. Right, pre-approved plans. I know you're having a robust conversation in the region about those. Jennifer Settle in our Chicago office worked on the South Bend pre-approved plans, which have delivered some really good results. And to be honest, I think this is part of the system that needs to be put in place to enable this. And we're doing a handful of ADU pre-approved types up and down California. Just a really neat part of it's kind of a package of missing middle solutions. So I wanted to make sure that I included some regional solutions, right? Because so I was first here 7 years ago, and I was here, a developer brought me in, and we looked at some opportunities, and then I was last in 2 years ago for the ULI event, and I'll tell you the rate of what I would call unchecked growth that's happened in your region. It was shocking the last time I got off the plane 2 years ago, and I didn't recognize the place. And so I was excited to hear that you've been talking about and strategizing about regional solutions, right? And so we were recently hired by the Washington State Department of Commerce to create a shared missing middle zoning toolkit for the entire Puget Sound region. And not an easy thing to do, but this will apply to 3 counties and 82 jurisdictions, and it's optional at this point. Some of the state legislation that came just after this will actually kind of nudge the local jurisdictions to use this because it's actually more nuanced than the state legislation. But basically, we did a thorough analysis of the different types of places that exist in that region, and then delivered a set of missing middle zoning tools for that area. And we know, right, some cities have more planning staff, more capability, more capacity. And so we actually did two sets of the standards, which are a very basic standard. It's like 2 pages per zoning district, and then a more detailed standard. And the city can pick which of those approaches that they actually want for their missing middle zoning toolkit application. And there was a robust education package. We did videos, we did posters, we did just these 3D imagery of just showing a single family neighborhood evolving into a missing middle neighborhood. So it's a super robust catalog. So the last public example I wanted to show tackles how one region tackled the growth framework challenge. And this is Beaufort County, South Carolina. I do like the Salt Lake City model too. And I think that's now almost 25, maybe even 30 years old. So they've been doing it for a while. But this was a project we did about 10 years ago where the most important thing after a series and many, many layers of analysis, working with the county to determine the location of where it makes sense for growth to go, right? Its infrastructure, its natural context, its existing circulation networks, proposed circulation networks, but also what type of development should happen where. Because there are a lot of comprehensive plans or even regional plans that show a node, right? They show a circle, but it could be anything. It could be a strip mall with big box stores and fast food restaurants, or it could be a compact mixed-use walkable neighborhood. And in Beaufort, what they said is every one of those dots is where the compact walkable urbanism will happen. And we defined a range of different place types that each one of those circles represents. But I think most of us in the room know that roadway design matters. And you've got a bad case of roadway design, I'm sorry, but every time one of these regional roads entered into one of these new places or communities or villages, the roads became context sensitive and became more pedestrian friendly. And that was hugely controversial. So we had to model that, our transportation engineer, and it demonstrated that you could actually get, if you were commuting from one corner of the county to one of the existing towns, by that simple sort of pedestrianization of streets just in the walkable places, it would add like a minute or two maximum to their commute. So there wasn't a huge impact, but that was really, really important because if you try to get a big 6-lane suburban roadway through the middle of a walkable urban place, it's going to tremendously impact the success of that. And then this was just all implemented with a new form-based code and just a really comprehensive system that I think something like that you could learn a lot from. It almost started with more of a illustrative framework plan and then built support for this. Okay, I probably need to speed up a little bit here. But I want to show some of the private sector missing middle solutions. So for the planners and decision makers in the room, sort of the question that like framing this, I don't want to just present projects to presenting projects, is like thinking about what would these be allowed by right in your community? And if not, what would it take to make these projects allowed by right? And for developers, a really interesting thought of these projects is not a single one of our developer clients uses a conventional market analysis for their projects, right? Because those look in a rear view mirror as opposed to looking forward. Now they're really thoughtful and they know their markets really well, but none of them use a conventional market study. So this is a pretty basic one. I think I can go through this quickly because Ellie covered this as like, what happens when a city makes the most basic infill legal? is like you start getting these really great housing types like the cottage court delivered sort of by the market, which is really great to see. This is a river house cottage court that we did in Healdsburg, California, with 8 main homes and then 4 ADUs that were sold with 4 of the single-family homes. And then this particular project is a case study of what happens when the mayor becomes the champion of the project when he sees the original drawings and realize that this small town in the larger Omaha, Nebraska metro had a policy of preserving small town character, and he realized that this direction with the missing middle was a great way for them to deliver the needed housing choices without getting the big boxy apartment buildings in their community that they didn't really want. This is a 40-acre project. Duplex up to 8plex are the housing types. It's now 300 units completed and occupied, with another 300 plus units in being constructed right now, and just has proven the viability, the desire, and the demand for large-scale application of missing middle, as well as the really important small-scale application as well. And so I love this photo. The numbers represent the number of units in each of the buildings, but you can see there's a really nice variety and scale to the typologies, to the massing. It's laid out in a street network. The other thing I really love about this project, it's in a suburban context, right? There's no public transit. Everybody's going to drive, but it's parked at 1 parking space per unit off-street, right? So this demonstrates that you don't need more than 1. There's no guest parking requirement. I'm an advocate for just removing the parking and letting the market decide, but this project demonstrates you never need more than 1 space per unit, even in the most suburban conditions. So how does that work? The on-street parking makes up for the rest of the parking that is needed. And, there's a particular woman who lives in the smallest 1-bedroom apartment on the ground floor here that couldn't afford to live here if she had to pay that extra cost that's usually affiliated with a garage space. But she's happy to park her car on the street, and she actually likes that because she can see the car from her window and she can enter through her front door. Super, super interesting case study. It's called, we call it Prairie Queen. It's also called Bungalows on the Lake. We have systematized these types into a catalog that we are now delivering to developers with just a simple use fee, right? You can pay a use fee and we'll deliver these types through full construction drawings cost efficiently and time efficiently. And this is not something we did historically. We used to design every project custom, but we decided this is what we needed to do to meet the need and maximize our impact. I'm going to actually skip this, but right. How many of your jurisdictions allow 28 feet curb to curb with parking on both sides? Does anybody know? I didn't assess it. Does any of it? Do you think any of them do? So we're working on a project in Athens, Georgia, and their fire chief said, I want 40 feet curb to curb. And all I had to do is show this photo with these lines to show how ludicrous it was. And not only, but how much additional cost it was to our client to make that 40-foot clear. So we're navigating that and figuring out a way to get to that. And can anybody say, do you feel that multifamily, how many areas, jurisdictions in your region is multifamily allowed? Like I said, I don't like that term, but with only 1 parking space per unit. Does anybody know? Like, is it very few probably? Or are there more than typical? Okay. So right, there's barriers that are easy to identify that looking at some of these case studies. I just want to quickly show, when I was here 2 years ago, this project was just starting construction. This is Cul-de-sac Tempe. It's a missing middle scale car-free community that will be the largest in the country, one completed. And the great thing is over the course of the last 2 years, The project now has the first 2 phases completed, over 100 residents, multiple businesses, a small market in it, and it's proven the success of this car-free model. And it's 18 acres, it's not huge, but the mixed-use component was really important to provide some of that walkability. And they do this great flea market with local artists every Thursday night that help build that sense of community. And I can't imagine, is there any jurisdiction that allows car-free development? Yeah, there is. John said. Rogers. Congratulations to Rogers. That's awesome. Yeah, so like part of this is just like, you don't want to force anybody to do this, but let's give them the option, right? And let the developers be creative to deliver these choices that people are really looking for. Half of the first phase residents in that project moved from another state to live car-free. So there's a tremendous draw to that. What happens when a city removes density caps? Right, that example I showed you earlier with 120 units per acre, we actually are designing a new version of this. Santa Maria, California removed density caps from their downtown specific plan and said, they defined the form and scale still, right, it was purely form-based. And so we're designing this 130 unit per acre micro unit project, courtyard project in the downtown there, which we're super, super excited about. And I would say, people are like, oh, micro units, probably not. I think every market, even your market, there's a real demand and a need for these micro unit projects. So just something to think about. Okay, last one. So what happens if a city allows ADUs to be sold separate from the primary unit? Seattle did that. And so our developer client said, hey, guess what? For every primary unit I sell, I'm going to sell a smaller, more attainably priced ADU, right? So super, super interesting. I think this is really where cities need to go. So just want to mention that National Association of Home Builders has become really good advocates for missing middle. We've done some great work with them. AARP is probably the biggest sort of advocate group at this point, and we did this publication that's free download for them, and we've been educating their members for the last 5 years about the benefits of missing middle housing. So I eat, drink, and sleep missing middle, as can be shown by this photo of my Monopoly scenario when I was playing Monopoly with my 14-year-old son a few weeks ago. I was like, I'm always thinking about this. So it's always great to come to an audience like this that's really trying to tackle this housing issue. Just a couple of other references. I wrote an article on the top 5 mistakes that cities are making when trying to deliver missing middle. And then I recently wrote an article on the top 10 tips for cities considering pre-approved plans. So you can just Google those and they will show up. Once again, thanks to Duke and Groundwork for hosting me and hosting this great event. There are free books available. You can come up and grab them at the end of the event. Please do reach out on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn if you want to connect and sort of be part of that conversation. But I think what's great is that sort of bringing this back to a close is like your region's in dire need of some innovation. And it's, as your prices get higher and higher, not only can people not afford to buy, but there's people at the bottom kind of getting pushed into unstable housing situations, which is a really, really bad place to be. And I feel like what's great about your region and all the times I've engaged in the conversation is you've got realtors, you've got developers, you've got policy people, you've got decision makers, and that's really what it takes to make a dent in the need for this. And so I know that you will all step up, and I encourage you all to step up and play a role in providing the solutions in your region.
Let's give Daniel a round of applause.